words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. There are two ways in which we can look at our existence and the existence of our whole universe. The one is through God and the presence of God, and the other is through the absence of God. The Bible, of course, speaks about the presence of God. God began everything. He created all that exists, not just on this earth, but throughout the whole universe. He also then, after creating humanity, began to interact. And so he calls Abraham, he calls Isaac, Jacob, he calls Moses, he calls the prophets. He continues to reach out to people, to help them, to heal them, and to encourage them. Sometimes he reprimands them. He promises judgment, and judgment comes. And then there is also redemption. God did these things in the Bible, and he continues to do them on a daily basis today. The Bible tells us he's extremely active. On the other side of that coin, however, is those people who say, no, we don't need to take God into consideration. And so, for instance, if you would buy a book on the history of Israel, you would find perhaps the name of Abraham, Moses, but you would find nowhere in that history book any mention of God. Sure, Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, but the historian would look toward Egypt to see what kind of records there were, to see how and when these people would have left. There'd be no mention of God. If we would skip ahead to when the Assyrians attacked the northern kingdom of Israel and decimated it, the historian might tell you something, well, the Assyrians wanted to increase their power, and Israel was an easy target, and so they conquered it. But if you look to the Bible, it would not tell you that. The prophets would tell you that this is a punishment on the people because they committed idolatry. They fell away from God, and they began to worship other false gods. And so consequently, you are going to be punished. If we look at science, science tells us that the universe was created some 14 billion years ago. And they say, at least this is the latest theory, that it was created out of a big bang. That's what they call it. And everything began to spread outward from that moment on. And from that, everything began to be formed. The stars, the planets, and all of the other worlds that are out there. Today, as they look in the heavens, they continue to see that all the galaxies are flying away from each other. The universe seems to be expanding ever more. And so by deducing it backwards, they say, well, at some point, all of this must have been in one tiny spot full of energy. And all of a sudden, it exploded. Well, that's a whole lot different from what the first chapter of Genesis tells us. Because the first chapter of Genesis tells us that God spoke, and there was light. And he spoke again, and something else was created. And so on and so on, for 6 days. But you see, they're not incompatible with one another, because each of these answers different questions. Science wants to tell us when something happened and how it happened. It happened some 14 billion years ago. There was a Big Bang. The Bible answers other questions. It wants to tell us who and why. God did it. He did it because he wanted to share his love with everyone. The Bible doesn't care and can't answer the questions of when and how. And science can't answer the question of who or why. They're looking at two different aspects of it. And so, there's no reason that God couldn't have created with a Big Bang, speaking his word. It can all mesh together. Even though there have been in the past many, many conflicts concerning this, there was no need for that. God went on to create humanity, to share the love that he had. He wanted to love them and have men and women love him. And that lasted, how long? A brief period of time. Because men and women began to say, well, we don't need God. We can do this all ourselves. And so they turned from the Creator God, and they began to worship the creation. Things that they had control over. And sin developed. What is sin? Sin is nothing less than not trusting God. Sin fractured the relationship between God and humans. Friend, sin fractured the whole world. There was this separation. And it longed for a time when it could be brought back together again. And it did not happen until Jesus. The love of the Father, the great love of the Father for us, for his world, was now reflected in his Son. And the Son gave back this same love to the Father as he lived out his life. He obeyed the Father, even so far as dying on the cross. And so, as a result, God raised him from the dead. We're in the Easter season. We remember the resurrection. Jesus' soul or spirit did not simply fly off to God and his body remain in the tomb. He himself, all of him, was raised from the dead. We say that we believe in the resurrection of the body. He was raised from the dead. His disciples saw him. He looked the same. They could touch him. They saw him eat. Yes, his body at this point had different properties. He could appear, he could disappear. He could go from one place to another quickly. A locked door didn't keep him out of a room. But nevertheless, Jesus was alive. All of him. And so this then is the hope that we have. St. Paul speaks about Jesus as being the first fruits of what will one day come. And it's interesting to see how he gets this. We know that Passover was a holiday that celebrated the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. But it was also an agricultural holiday. This was the time when the first fruits of the barley crop were presented to God. And they looked forward to a time when the full crop would be harvested. 7 weeks later was Pentecost. Again, this was a holiday where they gave back to God the first fruits of the wheat harvest, knowing that the main harvest would come later on. And Paul takes this figure and develops it, and he applies it now to the resurrection. Jesus is the first fruits, he says, and we will be raised sometime in the future. There's no doubt about it in Paul's mind. And as Jesus, all of us will be raised. Nowhere in the New Testament does it speak about a soul going off to heaven when we die. We are one. What we see in front of us, you see me, I see you, that's who we are. And that's what God raises. You see, if it were simply the fact that our soul went off and our bodies stayed where they were, death would not be defeated. If Jesus' body remained in the tomb, death would still have its control. But no, all of him was raised. Death didn't have its final say. God had the final say. Jesus is raised from the dead. And we look forward to that same hope, a hope that was promised to us in baptism. Our second lesson was from Revelation. And these last couple of chapters, 21 and 22, give us a vision that's not easy to understand. And John, who writes this Revelation, and Paul himself, they struggle with words and with images as to speak about something that's unspeakable. But again, John doesn't speak about us going off to heaven, but he speaks about a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven. The new Jerusalem will come down to the earth. There'll be a new heaven. There'll be a new earth. Everything, you see, is redeemed. God doesn't throw away the old and start anew, because right from the first day he said, this is good. And on the second day of creation, this is good. The world, the creation is good. And in the end, God is bringing together heaven and earth. They seem to be far away for us, but they are not. And he uses this image as a wedding. A man and a woman seem totally different, and yet they're able to come together, and they're able to be one, and they're able to share a love. And so heaven and earth now come together, and God's love is then at the end made completely manifest. These are only images. We can't begin to imagine what it will be. We can only know that the love of God, which we've experienced our whole life, will continue. Nowhere does the New Testament talk about us playing harps, as angels. No, we are going to be continuing in some way to share the love of God, to spread that love of God. And as God once had this wonderful idea of our world, he has other ideas that in our resurrection state we will use, and we will continue to have that love and share the love that he gives us, and we in return give to him. Amen. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Our next hymn is 367.